time for a Puscast, a review of the infectious disease literature, covering the articles that were published in the first 15 days in the year 2017. References are available at edgydoc.com, where you will find links to my growing multimedia empire, books, podcasts, blogs, apps, and more. Don't forget, of course, to go to amazon.com and check out The Pus Whisperer, Volumes 1 and 2. The perfect gift for the pus lover in your life. But you're not here to hear me pimp myself. You're here for the medical literature. So let's get to it, shall we? Before we get started with the medical literature, I would like to point to a review by the Chinese government over Chinese research in the biomedical field, where they found that 80% of the studies were fabricated. So, unfortunately, if you have a study coming out of China, you have to wonder if it's in the 80% that's fabricated or the 20% that may be legit. And of course, if it's acupuncture or moxibustion or traditional Chinese pseudomedicine, you know it's bogus. But this is an example as to why we are doomed. They found a cave in New Mexico that's been undisturbed by human beings. They found a bacterium that's been growing underground, 1,000 feet underground, called Paenibacillus. And it's the nature of this cave that organisms have been multiplying and evolving for 4 million years apart from humans. And what did they find in this particular bacteria? 18 different resistance genes. Or perhaps I should say it, resistant to 18 different antibiotics, including, for example, daptomycin. The Borg had it wrong. Resistance is not futile. Resistance is inevitable. Our thin patina of antibiotics is just a temporary fluke of good luck. As an example of what we have to look forward to, the CDC reported a Klebsiella pneumoniae that was resistant to all, underline all, antibiotics. It was a new Delhi beta-lactamase producer, so it whacked the carbapenems. It was colistin resistant and was only intermediate to tigecycline. This is our future, and along with climate change, I don't think there's much that humans are going to do to reverse the trend. Oddly, I've never been much of a psychology fan, but I remember back in college I took a psych course as part of my pre-med requirements. And I learned that if you put a dog in a cage and you shock it and it can't escape, it just gets depressed and sits there. It's called learned helplessness. Welcome to the future. Vancomycin and piperacillin tazobactam appear to be the most popular decerebrate combination of antibiotics. Let me tell you right now, stop it. And this study was the best to date to show that patients on Vanco plus Pip-Tazo not only have an increased risk of acute kidney injury, but a more rapid onset of acute kidney injury compared to those who are put on vancomycin and cefepime. Presuming, of course, no shortage of cefepime. But there are now multiple studies to demonstrate this particular adverse reaction. So don't give Vanc and Pip-Tazo unless you have a good reason. And I have to admit, 31 years in the biz, and I've never written an order for Zosyn. My brother has a friend who's proud of the fact that he's never eaten an apple in his life. I suppose I have the same hubris. But I was trained with a distrust of beta-lactamase inhibitors unless you had no other option, and I've never seen a reason to abandon that mistrust. Morbilliviruses, or viri I suppose, are a group of viruses best known in humans as the cause of measles. In animals, it causes rinderpest, the measles of cattle, that's since been eradicated from the planet. It also causes peste des petits ruminants. How's my French? An infection of ruminants. And there's also a cetacean morbillivirus, the measles, I suppose, of dolphins and whales. And there was a report of a mass stranding of sperm whales in Italy, and they were all infected with the dolphin morbillivirus. Dolphin morbillivirus, like the other viruses in that family, are associated with mass killings of whales and dolphins. I'm sure we could get humans interested in a vaccine that would save the whales even if we can't get them interested in a vaccine that will save the children, given that measles kills 100,000 plus every year in the world. We need to do a Star Trek episode where the whales brought back to the future give humans measles again. Wouldn't that be a hoot for an episode? The other similar virus that affects animals in the ocean is norovirus, and there was an outbreak of noroviruses in harbor porpoises. Poor things have to swim in their own diarrhea, as well as one in a sea lion. And the norovirus that they isolated in the dolphin had a 99% sequence homology to the virus found in oysters, which causes outbreaks in humans. So make sure that you don't eat your whales, sea lions, or porpoises raw. We are in the midst of what appears to be a nasty flu season. Flu vaccine, it's important to remember, is not a binary vaccine. There's more to getting the flu vaccine than just not getting the flu, since it's not a great vaccine for that. But if you get vaccinated, you're less likely to have a severe illness, and therefore perhaps are less infectious. You're less likely to end up in the hospital. If you end up in the hospital, you're less likely to end up in the ICU. And if you end up in the ICU or have other comorbidities like pregnancy or AIDS or transplant or dialysis, you're less likely to die. The other interesting thing about the flu vaccine has been its use and its subsequent association with a decrease in vascular events. There are very few infections that are not, when looked at, found to be prothrombotic and to have the sequela of stroke, myocardial infarction, or pulmonary embolism in the months following an acute infection. And this study out of Taiwan looked at the risk of hemorrhagic stroke in patients with atrial fibrillation and found that if they had the flu vaccine, they were less likely to go on to develop a hemorrhagic stroke secondary to their atrial fibrillation. I have to admit I'm not as enthusiastic about this particular study, as it's hard to come up with a pathologic mechanism for preventing a hemorrhagic stroke, but it's still interesting nonetheless, and all the literature that look at the results of flu vaccine, all of it points the same direction. Getting the flu vaccine is subsequently associated with decreased vascular events. Hepatitis E has different epidemiologies around the world. In Europe and America, it tends to be spread by eating pig innards, specifically liver. This study looked at wild boars and deer in Germany and found not only was hepatitis E found in the wild pigs, but also deer as well. Yet another reason to be careful slaughtering and eating wild deer. There was also a case report of hepatitis E spread with platelet transfusions, which is a shame, as I guess I'm going to have to throw away my recipe for wild boar liver marinated in human platelets. But wild boar are ubiquitous in the United States, like in the South, and whether or not they've also spread it to deer in these parts of the world, the United States, is unknown. But it wouldn't surprise me. Zika seems to have subsided for the time being. Zika is, just to remind you, can be spread from male to female as a sexually transmitted disease. It also can last for a fair amount of time in vaginal secretions. And they can find a positive PCR, which does not necessarily mean infectious organisms, up to 20 days in serum, urine, saliva, and vaginal swabs. And finally, it's quite remarkable how quickly these infections can spread. They went back and looked at the time course of spread of Zika in Brazil and found that it moved along at an average of 42 kilometers per day, or 15,000 kilometers a year. 42 kilometers a day would be, 500 miles? No, wait. Half a mile? Can't do my metric. Actually, it's 19 miles a day, which doesn't surprise me. There was a study a couple years back that showed that dengue virus and chikungunya swept through Cameroon in about a year and a half. These viruses move quickly once they get into the right environment. The life expectancy of HIV patients is increasingly approaching that of non-HIV patients, but the problem seems to be ongoing inflammation. Even in patients who remain suppressed, for example, but are not completely adherent with their medications, there will be ongoing signs of inflammation by way of biomarkers. This is also true in early HIV infection, where some of the biomarkers of inflammation remain elevated despite complete suppression of HIV clinically, which, again, inflammation is prothrombotic, blah, 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 but it does explain why there is an increase in cardiovascular events in patients with HIV disease. Even though the infection is apparently suppressed, the inflammatory response is only incompletely suppressed as a result. As I have said many times before, if you could actually boost the immune system, you'd kill people with stroke, heart attack, and pulmonary emboli. Inflammation, boosting the immune system, the inflammatory response is fundamentally bad if you're not infected. And even if you are. Even with evolution, no good deed goes unpunished. And speaking of no good deed going unpunished, how's that for a segue? Nature does abhor a vacuum. And they found in the United Kingdom that invasive pneumococcal disease has increased. The interesting thing is the epidemiology. It hasn't increased in strains covered by the conjugated vaccine, but has been either in strains not in either vaccine or in strains in the 23-valent half-assed vaccine that we've had for years. In strains not covered by the vaccine, it's 15A, 23A, and 35F, which is my locker combination in high school. And in those in the 23-valent vaccine, it's 8, 9N, and 12F. So what we really need is an 83-valent conjugated pneumococcal vaccine that gets everything. You open up an ecologic niche by getting rid of the strains in the Prevnar, they're going to be filled with something. Invasive Haemophilus B has disappeared virtually in the United States. Unfortunately, not completely, though. There were 3 children in Missouri, all 3 Amish, all 3 unvaccinated, who got invasive Haemophilus, one of whom died. It's sad that children are still dying of vaccine-preventable illnesses, now aided and abetted by the anti-vaccine lunacy of the Cleveland Clinic's Director of Wellness. You probably read about his wackaloon screed against vaccines last week. It has been unfortunately widely republished in the anti-vaccine websites so that probably more children will die of vaccine-preventable illnesses. Go Cleveland Clinic. There is a study on the treatment of yaws that found that azithromycin, 30 milligrams per kilogram, single dose, is non-inferior to IM benzathine penicillin, which is good news for eradication programs since it's certainly easier to give a pill than it is to give an intramuscular shot in resource-poor areas. It also reminds me, as I've said before, that growing up in Northeast Portland was a restaurant called Yaws. They were noted for their special treponema sauce that was put on the burgers and fries. Small world. People do a surprisingly crappy job, I think, at the treatment of cellulitis. A recent study suggested that it wasn't the choice of antibiotics, but patient comorbidities that determined a slow response. This study looked at the linezolid versus tenazolid studies and found that if patients were looking good at 2 or 3 days, it predicted a good long-term response. But not looking good at 2 or 3 days did not predict a poor response. Quote, lack of early problematically determined treatment success, however, was a poor indicator of late clinical failure, with many early non-responders ultimately experiencing clinical success, end quote. In other words, when you start someone on therapy for cellulitis and they're not better after a couple of days, be patient. They don't need to be changed to vancomycin. Just keep the cefazolin going. They'll be fine. Trust me, I'm an infectious disease doctor. Why should you trust me? Well, this study looked at patients who were diagnosed with cellulitis in the ER who were then sent to a cellulitis clinic. And what happened? Well, automatic ID consultation led to reduced hospitalization, more rapid narrowing of antibiotics, diagnosing things that weren't cellulitis but mimicking cellulitis, and ID consultation more often led to identification in treatment of the underlying reason for the cellulitis. As I've always said, the only true holistic doctors are infectious disease doctors. And ID docs seem to be the only people who really know how to treat cellulitis. I almost think, like Staph aureus bacteremia, that it should mandate an infectious disease consultation. I don't know about you, but if I were a superhero, my archenemy would be Staph aureus. It is my bête noire, and I spend a significant amount of time trying to figure out how to kill Staph aureus, especially MRSA. There's been interesting data on the use of beta-lactams and daptomycin in the treatment of MRSA infections, and even with MRSA, oxacillin will make daptomycin more effective. This study looked at oxacillin as a modifier of Staph aureus virulence and found that MRSA infections that were treated with oxacillin were less virulent in an animal model, increasing the ability of the host to kill the staph off. And there is one study that showed decreasing bacteremia by a day in patients treated with both vancomycin and flucloxacillin. This is a mouse model, and their advice that all patients with MRSA infection should have nafcillin as well seems a wee bit premature, but there is a lot of intriguing data to suggest that the addition of oxacillin to MRSA therapy is of benefit, and that the MRSA phenotype is not an all-or-nothing phenomenon. It is the kind of data that makes the pharmacy budget director have the heebie-jeebies, however. When I think of E. coli 015787, I think of undercooked hamburgers. However, the other white meat, no, not cat, but pork, is also a source of E. coli infections. And there was an outbreak in Alberta, Canada, that involved 117 infections that was traced back to pork, and in this case, consuming the pork in Asian restaurants. It was traced back to, quote, an illegal pork distributor who fraudulently sold pork as chicken. He was issued a court order to close the business and appear before questioning, but he failed to appear, and a warrant for his arrest was issued. An illegal pork distributor selling pork as chicken. Who'da thunk it? BTW, a meta-analysis suggests that chlorhexidine neither prevents nor treats mucositis in cancer patients, although it does have side effects, including teeth staining and altered taste perception. So it would appear that chlorhexidine for mucositis has no benefits, only side effects. Like that's going to stop anybody. I would be surprised if such a meta-analysis changes practice anywhere. I always find the epidemiology of disease to be amazing. For example, the Mycobacterium abscessus that's found in cystic fibrosis patients is one strain that has spread across the world. Even more curiously, they've looked at the Candida auris, A-U-R-I-S, that has emerged recently. This particular Candida is resistant to most, if not all, the antifungals that we have and has a high mortality rate. What is curious about Candida auris, is that there are 3 separate unrelated clonal outbreaks of this organism, one each in Venezuela, Pakistan and India, and South Africa. So all 3 Staph aureus are different clonal populations of an event that occurred in 3 different places all at the same time, which is just amazing. Who knows what's in that cave in New Mexico? There's probably a Candida in there that will be even more virulent. But as the Borg said, resistance is inevitable. It's really quite remarkable, though, what the insights you gain from genetic sequencing of organisms and looking to see if they're really related or not. We really need this kind of technology at the clinical level to see about outbreaks in the hospital, coagulase-negative staph bacteremias, etc., to know, are we really seeing the same bug or different bug? Because you can't tell often from the phenotype. You got to go for the genotype. There is no such thing as good bacteria or good fungi. The promulgators of probiotics like to suggest that the organisms they are giving you are somehow good, but they are for the most part not part of the normal gastrointestinal microbiome. You're giving people a pathogen or a potential pathogen. And there's a case report of someone with Saccharomyces boulardii fungemia from his probiotic tablet in an otherwise immunocompetent patient. It's long been debated whether or not the lactobacilli or Saccharomyces that occasionally pop up in the blood cultures are from probiotics or not. But it's safe to say if you're going to ingest foreign live bacteria, you should probably have a good reason for it, like Hefeweizen. I once had a patient who was an AIDS patient. He was a home brewer, and he got Saccharomyces cerevisiae in his blood, presumptively from his beer brewing paraphernalia. You could say I knew what ailed him. Yeah, I know I've used that joke before, but it's a true story, and I just happen to like that particular pun. Regular listeners will hear some repetition of the alleged humor found in this podcast, although I'll admit most of the time I can't remember the jokes if I said them before or not. I've been doing this now for 11 years. There's a lot of verbiage out there for me. Ascaris is found in pigs and in people who take care of pigs. But as an interesting epidemiologic note to finish up the Puscast this week, genetic analysis does find that this parasite goes from humans to pigs and then from pigs to humans. And there are swine, human, and hybrid forms of Ascaris. Just think of all the organisms having sex in your colon right now. One of the many reasons I'm glad I had a colectomy. And that brings us to a close of the podcast. I will note that the IDSA and the American Thoracic Society just released guidelines on the diagnosis of tuberculosis in adults and children. I haven't read it yet, but next time I'm doing a cross-country flight and have trouble sleeping, I know where I can find a good Ambien substitute. Otherwise, that brings us to the end of this Puscast, covering the first 15 days of the year 2017. References are available online at edgydot.com, where you will find links to my growing multimedia empire. Of course, don't forget to write me glowing reviews on iTunes, as well as buy my books over at amazon.com, because the world needs more Mark Crislip. Other than that, thank you as always for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case. I shall continue to follow along with you. Thank you. In dictation. Goodbye.